Imagine this. You're dressed in white, standing at the edge of a dark underground chamber. You can hear the crowds above growing silent. Your heart is pounding. You're about to be sealed inside a tomb, not because you're dead, but because Rome has decided you're guilty. And the worst part? You're one of the most sacred, most honored women in the entire empire. Your crime? Being accused of breaking your vow of chastity. Your punishment? Being buried alive with nothing but a lamp, some bread, a little water, and the slow, suffocating darkness. This isn't some horror movie plot. This actually happened in ancient Rome, and it was reserved for the Vestal Virgins, the holiest women in Roman society. So, buckle up, because today we're diving deep into one of the most disturbing rituals in ancient history, and trust me, it's way darker than you think. Let's start at the beginning, because to understand why Rome would do something this brutal, you need to know who these women were. The Vestal Virgins weren't just any priestesses. They were literally the spiritual backbone of Rome, the living connection between the city and its gods. And here's the thing. They didn't volunteer for this job. They were chosen, captured even, when they were just little girls. Picture this. You're 6, maybe 7 years old, playing with your friends, living your normal Roman childhood, when suddenly the Pontifex Maximus, basically the most powerful priest in Rome, shows up and decides you're the one. Your parents have no say. You have no say. It's done. They called it the captio ceremony, which literally means capture, because that's exactly what it felt like. These girls were torn away from their families forever, and even though it was considered this massive honor, historical records tell us that parents wept. They knew what it meant. Their daughter was gone, not dead, but might as well be. Beacon.
She would never truly be part of their family again. And it wasn't like they could just pick anyone. Oh no, Rome had very specific requirements. You had to be freeborn, meaning no slaves or former slaves, unless your family had been freed and earned citizenship. Both your parents had to be alive and respectable, with absolutely no scandals attached to your family name. You couldn't have any physical imperfections or mental defects because remember, you were going to represent Rome itself. In the early days, only patrician families, the absolute elite, could have their daughters chosen. But as Rome grew and changed, they eventually opened it up to daughters of freedmen, which tells you just how hard it was to find girls who met all these insane standards. But once you were chosen, that was it. The temple became your home, the other Vestals became your sisters, and the sacred fire became your entire life. Now let's talk about what these girls actually did for 30 years. Because yes, you heard that right, 30 full years of service. The first 10 years were basically training. You learned every ritual, every prayer, every sacred rule that governed your existence. The second decade was when you did the real work, performing all the ceremonies and maintaining the sacred duties. And the final 10 years, you became a teacher, passing down everything you learned to the next generation of Vestals. And there were only 6 of them serving at any given time, which meant the pressure was absolutely enormous. Their main job, the thing that mattered most, was keeping the sacred flame of Vesta burning. This wasn't just some symbolic candle. This was Rome's eternal flame, the fire that represented the city's very survival. If that flame went out, Romans believed disaster would follow. Famine, plague, military defeat, you name it. The flame going out meant the gods had abandoned Rome, and that was on you. But that wasn't their only job. They also prepared the mola salsa, these sacred cakes made from special salt and water that were used in almost every major Roman ritual. They had to fetch holy water from sacred springs, never from common wells, because everything they touched had to be pure and untainted. They participated in major festivals throughout the year, always visible, always performing, always reminding Romans that the gods were watching and that their city was protected. The symbolism here is actually fascinating when you think about it. The Temple of Vesta was designed to represent Rome's hearth, the center of the household, and the Vestals were like the mothers of the entire civilization. They weren't actual mothers, obviously, since they could never marry or have children, but they were maternal guardians of Rome's spiritual life. Every Roman citizen was, in a weird way, their child. The safety of the state, the favor of the gods, the very survival of Roman civilization, all of it rested on these women staying pure and keeping that flame alive. So naturally, Rome rewarded them, right? Well, yes and no, because here's where things get really interesting. The Vestals had privileges that no other woman in Rome could even dream of.
They could own property in their own name, which was revolutionary in a society where women were basically property themselves. Their legal testimony was accepted without requiring an oath, something that even most men didn't enjoy. They could write wills and decide who got their belongings after they died. They were released from their father's authority, which in Roman law was a huge deal because fathers had absolute power over their children. When a Vestal traveled through Rome, she rode in a covered carriage with an escort and everyone had to get out of her way. At the Colosseum, she sat in the front row with senators and MPs. Roars. If she happened to cross paths with a condemned criminal on his way to execution, she had the power to pardon him on the spot. People treated them like living goddesses, stepping aside, bowing their heads, showing reverence that bordered on worship. Their living conditions were pretty incredible too. The Atrium Vesti, the palace where they lived, was absolutely stunning. We're talking marble floors, beautiful fountains, peaceful courtyards, and statues commemorating Vestals from centuries past. It was basically a luxury compound, and for 30 years, it was their entire world. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. All of these privileges came with 3 absolute, non-negotiable laws that governed every single moment of their lives. First, perpetual virginity. No relationships, no intimacy, no marriage for 3 full decades. Second, absolute obedience to the priests and especially the Pontifex Maximus. Third, the sacred flame must never, ever go out. Break any of these rules and the consequences were catastrophic. Let's focus on that flame for a second because Romans were absolutely obsessed with it. They genuinely believed that the strength of the flame reflected the strength of Rome itself. A strong, steady flame meant the gods were happy and Rome was secure. A flickering or weak flame meant trouble was coming. And if it went out completely, that was interpreted as the gods withdrawing their protection, a sign of impending disaster. The responsibility was crushing. Imagine being in charge of something where the tiniest mistake, a gust of wind, a moment of carelessness, could be seen as you personally endangering the entire empire. The Vestals took shifts watching the flame, never leaving it unattended, living in constant fear of that one moment of bad luck that could destroy their lives. If the flame did go out, even by accident, the punishment was brutal. The Pontifex Maximus would take the guilty Vestal to a secret room and scourge her, basically whip her while she was naked. It was meant to be a private humiliation, but everyone knew it happened, and the psychological weight was enormous. You lived every day knowing that one mistake could lead to public disgrace and unbearable pain. But that was nothing compared to what happened if you were accused of breaking your vow of chastity. This was called crimen incesti, the crime of unchastity, and it wasn't just seen as a personal failing. It was considered sacrilege, a crime against the divine order itself. Romans believed that if a Vestal lost her virginity, her impurity would pollute the entire city and bring down the wrath of the gods on everyone. Military defeats, natural disasters, plagues, all of it could be blamed on one Vestal's supposed impurity. The accusations were rare, but when they happened, they created absolute chaos. The entire city would be thrown into panic, and the political implications were massive. History gives us some genuinely disturbing examples. In 216 BC, right after Rome suffered a devastating defeat against Hannibal, 2 Vestals named Opimia and Floronia were accused and condemned. Was there actual evidence? Who knows? But Rome needed a scapegoat for the military disaster, and the Vestals were perfect targets. Later, Emperor Elagabalus was accused posthumously of violating a Vestal, which was almost certainly fabricated to justify his assassination and damnatio memoriae. The point is, these accusations were often political weapons. A Vestal's fall from grace was so dramatic, so shocking, that it could be used to explain away anything or destroy anyone. The trials themselves were heavily influenced by politics rather than evidence. The accused Vestals had very little opportunity to defend themselves, and if a man was involved, he'd be executed too. But let's be real, the focus was always on punishing the woman. Now we get to the part that's truly nightmare fuel. When a Vestal was found guilty of breaking her vow, Rome had a problem. They couldn't just execute her like a common criminal because her blood was sacred. Shedding it directly would anger the gods even more. So they came up with something arguably worse. They would bury her alive. The execution site was called the Campus Celeratus, the Field of the Wicked, located just outside the city walls. The whole thing was designed as a ritual handover to the gods rather than an execution by human hands. Rome could claim they weren't actually killing her, just sealing her away and letting the gods decide her fate. It was a legal and religious fiction that let them sleep at night. The final journey was horrifying in its symbolism. The condemned Vestal would be dressed in bridal clothes. This terrible irony, since she'd never been allowed to marry. She'd be placed in a covered litter and carried through the forum in complete silence. No one spoke. No one jeered. The whole city held its breath. When they reached the Campus Celeratus, there'd be an underground chamber waiting, already prepared with a bed, a lamp, some bread, a little water, and some milk. These provisions were symbolic, allowing Rome to say they'd given her the means to survive, that her death was in the gods' hands, not theirs. Then she'd be sealed inside. They'd cover the entrance with earth and stones, and that was it. No funeral, no prayers, no tombstone, no memory. She was erased from history, as if she'd never existed. The cruelty of it is almost incomprehensible. One day, you're worshipped as a living goddess. The next, you're suffocating in darkness, completely forgotten. This wasn't legend or mythology. This actually happened. Multiple ancient sources document it, and archaeological evidence supports the existence of the Campus Celeratus. The Vestal Virgins were real women, girls really, who lived their entire lives walking a tightrope between honor and obliviation. Beneath all the grandeur, the marble palaces, the front row seats at the Colosseum, was a system built on fear and control. These women were given incredible privilege but zero freedom, worshipped but watched constantly, honored but expendable the moment they became politically inconvenient, or were unlucky enough to have the flame go out on their watch. Was it really about faith and purity, or was it about power and having the perfect scapegoats when things went wrong? That's the question that haunts this whole dark chapter of Roman history, and honestly, the answer probably makes it even more disturbing.